This is Conversations in Civics. I'm Dr. Terri Susan Fine. Joining me for this conversation is Naze Sahebzamani. Naze is an IB teacher at Robinson High School in Tampa. Naze, tell me a bit about your students.
I teach American government to 9th graders.
Terrific. We have a pretty weighty subject today, U.S. domestic and foreign policy. Naze, do we start this conversation with a slightly domestic bent or a foreign policy bent?
I think it's very important to just start off distinguishing between the difference between foreign policy and domestic policy. Good
question. You know, especially in living in such a globalized world in the 21st century, it's sometimes hard to tell the difference because so many of our foreign policies affect what goes on domestically, and so many of our domestic policies impact how we interact with other nations. But when we're talking about domestic policy, we're really talking about sort of those public policies that are targeted towards U.S. citizens, others living in this country, sort of those that impact or at least are targeting only the, United States, even though, as I mentioned before, they do affect what goes on in other countries and our relationships with them. When we're talking about foreign policy, we're talking about how we interact with other countries, and naturally that foreign policy is based on United States interests. So as United States interests change, so too does the nature of U.S. foreign policy.
What are some basic examples of domestic policy?
You know, I remember when I was studying Franklin Roosevelt, who was president during the Great Depression, and during the Great Depression, people, unemployment was over 25%. Underemployment, which means that you're working below your capability, made things even worse and was much higher than that. And I used to often remember that people would say, well, because of how Franklin Roosevelt handled the presidency and his domestic policies, we often now look to the federal government to keep us healthy, wealthy, and wise, right? Healthy, meaning that we look to the government for healthcare policy and to keep us healthy and to be focusing on health concerns, to focus on our ability to earn money. We do live in a capitalistic economy, and so we say that the wealthy part is so that people can move forward if they want to, the idea that people can pursue opportunities in terms of their economic lives, etc. And then the wisdom would come from the concept of education. So we also look to the government to educate us and to educate us well and to provide opportunities for that education. So not just the content of the education, but also the opportunities to pursue it. So I like to often think of domestic policy like I did when I learned about Franklin Roosevelt, healthy, wealthy, and wise. So when we look at sort of healthcare policies, what we've seen an emergence of different healthcare policies over the years, particularly since the 1960s. President Johnson was responsible for signing the legislation for both Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare is providing medical care to the elderly, and in our country today, the elderly are 65 and older. Now, I'm sure that we all have grandparents who might disagree with whether or not 65 is the elderly, but nonetheless, those groups are protected by that particular domestic policy. When we talk about Medicaid, that's medical help for the poor. And so there are some persons who receive both Medicare and Medicaid because they are the elderly poor. But until a person is 65 and older, they can only receive Medicaid, and that's if they meet certain criteria. Franklin Roosevelt also signed into legislation the what we call welfare. And it's actually Old Age Survivors Disability Insurance, OASDI, but we often call that Social Security. We also have the creation of the aid for families with dependent children. We call that welfare. So welfare is the idea that you're looking after someone else's needs. And so when we talk about welfare programs, they take on all sorts of forms. Social Security is one, providing help to the poor is another, etc. So we find that in terms of sort of looking to our health, it's not just it's not just an income category, but it's also what categories we belong to in terms of our age and whether or not we're entitled to certain benefits as a consequence of that. We also have various policies that are different because some of them are merit-based, meaning that if we meet eligibility requirements for those policies, then we can have access to the benefits. But there are others where we cannot enjoy the benefits unless we have already contributed in some form, or our employer has contributed so that we can earn them. So Social Security is one of those. Social Security is something that's taken out of our paycheck up to a certain income level. That income level changes. Sometimes it feels to me like it changes every year, but it changes. So that I think it's about 7.75% of your income is taken out for Social Security. And the idea is if you live long enough, right, you can enjoy your Social Security. So that means that I think starting at the age of 62, you can start to receive Social Security, but it's a lower amount than if you work till you're 65 versus 68 and 70 and so forth. So we see all kinds of domestic policies relating to a person's ability to be healthy and to have a stable income, etc. We also have domestic policies that are relating to protecting workers and protecting companies and protecting business. So that's also part of that wealthy issue. There's unemployment insurance. We have rights for union members. We have rights for workers. We have, requirements, occupational safety and health, right? The Occupational Safety and Health Administration. We sometimes call that OSHA, okay? That's to make sure that your workplace doesn't kill you. Right? So there's all kinds of policies that affect our day-to-day lives, and we often sort of talk about those collectively as domestic policies.
That's great. And there's so many different types of domestic policies from what you're telling us. Mm-hmm. How does public opinion shape how domestic policy is created in a congressional or a state level?
That's such a great question because public policy is very complex. I mean, I don't know about you, but if I've ever seen C-SPAN or something, mm-hmm. and then you see the bill for something and it's usually like, this high off the floor, mm-hmm. and you say, who reads all that? But yet somehow we as individuals form opinions about it, and that then often shapes how our members of Congress and our representatives in the state legislature will vote on these issues. So one of the most sort of contentious is welfare policy. I talked to you about the welfare policies of the Roosevelt administration in that era. Well, in 1996, Bill Clinton signed something called the Personal Opportunity and Work Reconciliation Act, something like that. We often call it welfare reform. Mm-hmm. And that welfare reform took those policies from the Roosevelt era and changed them in significant ways. However, if you look at some of the ways that they were changed, Naze, you will find that those changes in many respects reflected public opinion on the issue. For example, there is a public opinion out there where people say that people on welfare are lazy. The reason why that they're not working or that they're not on welfare is because they're lazy. Now, as I said, if that bill is this high and people didn't read it, and didn't read all the research that went into it, why should that opinion matter? Well, because there's an election every 2 years. That's why it matters. Mm-hmm. Well, one of the components of welfare reform is that you cannot receive welfare benefits for more than 2 years at a time, with some exceptions, such as having a newborn baby is one of the exceptions. So you say, well, why would they? What if I'm still in need at the end of 2 years? Well, that reflects that public opinion that people are on welfare because they're lazy. One of the requirements to receive welfare benefits is that you work at least 30 hours a week, mm-hmm. okay? Well, the presumption is that you wouldn't be working unless you had to, right? So that also sort of feeds into that laziness issue. There's also a stereotype that people have more children so that they can have more welfare money. And so the welfare reform laws say that if you have a child when you're on welfare, then you don't receive any benefits for that child. So public opinion looking at welfare policy today has had an impact. More recently, there's been a big debate about health care policy. That President Obama signed a health care law in 2010, and that healthcare law certainly created all kinds of a stir about, does this mean that I can't choose my doctor? Does this mean that I can't have make certain autonomous decisions about the care that I receive? Because people associate government-run healthcare as being healthcare that is not sensitive to the individual. And so many people sort of look at those policies, and in fact the constitutionality of the policy has been tested already at the state level. And so we see that even the public's response to that health care reform, that health policy bill, has been really reflected in the 2010 congressional election and the 2010 statewide election in Florida, that Republicans did very, very well in their message that the health care policy was bad for America, bad for Florida, and Republicans did much better in 2010 than they might otherwise have had they not targeted that message that people really felt connected to.
Can you talk about how, once these domestic policies are placed, how it affects the average person on their day-to-day lives and how they should, in turn, reflect on that?
Well, certainly these policies affect day-to-day lives. When we started this great conversation just a few minutes ago, we talked about how domestic and foreign policy do impact one another. Well, imagine, if you will, if let's say the federal government imposes some requirements that if you're working at a plant that manufactures something, and in order for the plant to function, that there is waste that goes into the air, right? There's pollution that goes into the air as a consequence of producing that item. And so the federal government requires that there be what they call scrubbers on the chimneys. And the scrubbers then see to it that a lot of that waste is collected and contained instead of going out into the air. Well, that costs money. Not only do the scrubbers cost money, but you have to pay somebody to put them in, et cetera, et cetera. We also have a requirement in this country of a minimum wage, okay? So having a minimum wage means that a company might say, but wait a second, I don't think that you might not be worth X amount of dollars, and so I'd like to pay you less. And therefore I can't hire more people, I can't create more products or whatever it is, because I have to pay these higher wages. So those companies, as a result of those two domestic policies, an environmental policy and a minimum wage policy, might then say, you know something, I'm going to move overseas. I'm going to take my company to Mexico, where the environmental policies are much less, where the minimum wage policies either exist at a very low rate or not at all, where there aren't protections for workers, where there aren't protections for children. And consequently, we do see a relationship there between these two things. So indeed, in a person's day-to-day life, particularly in a bad economy, a company might say, well, we can't afford to be in business anymore, and that affects a person's ability to have a job, where they can live, what types of housing they can have as well.
I think one of the questions that a lot of the kids ask is, who comes up with this? Does the president come up with this all by himself? And, does he have a team that helps him come up with these different policies? So can you tell us something about, like, the Office of Policy Development and how they contribute to the president when it comes to making these decisions and policies?
Well, the Office of Policy Development, it's interesting that you asked that question, because do you think it's people just sitting in a cave somewhere just sort of making stuff up, or is it a matter of what you were talking about before, public opinion? Well, people's experience influences how they behave in a political world. And so clearly the president has his thumb on the pulse of America, sort of looking at what are the people looking for in government. Can I do that? If I do that, what will it cost me politically? What will it cost me in terms of other constituent groups, et cetera? So oftentimes what happens is that a president might have an idea or a goal, such as, for example, every child should read by the time they're in third grade. Okay? So the Office of Policy Development would have to come up with a plan for how that would work. How can we make it happen? What do we need to do in terms of teacher training, in terms of student preparation, in terms of school breakfast, you name it? What do we have to do in order to make that work? Naze, it's been such a pleasure to spend time with you today and to have this terrific conversation. We've been talking about U.S. domestic policy and some of the concepts related to those policies. That's Conversations in Civics. I'm Dr. Terri Susan Fine.